Hey everyone, this is Lomi, and today I'm going to be sharing a quick coloring for the Firal chibi that I made to go with Rune. The process I'm using is pretty much the same thing I did for Rune's coloring, so there's not a whole lot that I have that I can say. So instead I thought I would take a minute to tell you guys about a very strange experience I had recently involving a whole lot of alpaca wool. So back in November, my great uncle passed away kind of unexpectedly. He was, I guess you could say, kind of an eccentric person. He had a lot of stuff. There's not really a polite way to say that somebody is a hoarder, but he loved his stuff and he was very proud of it. So right after he passed, we started cleaning out his house and his garage, and one of the things that we started doing right away was looking for his boat. My whole life he had this pontoon boat, which it was nothing special, but he used to let me play on it when I was a kid. When Mom was looking for all the titles for his vehicles and things like that, she found that he still had the title for the boat. But my mom found paperwork in his house, in his office, that showed he had been supplying a number of spinning circles and like knitting guilds, all kinds of places like that, doll factories with wool to use for making yarn and using for doll hair. My parents told me there were probably a couple 100 pounds of wool, and at the time we were thinking sheep's wool, which doesn't keep well if it's not cleaned, so we actually kind of expected it to be gross. So he had been paying this guy to store the wool for him. Before my dad went out to actually see the wool, my mom found a sample in his house, and she told me about it. And I remember thinking, when she first told me that apparently my uncle had wool, I thought to myself, wouldn't it be funny if it ended up being alpaca wool? Which, it's such an unusual thing, why would anybody have that? So I mentioned it, and we kind of laughed about it, and then my mom found a sample. She sent me a picture, and I realized, oh my gosh, that's Surrey alpaca, which is exactly what I use for doll wigs. So I was kind of feeling like the luckiest person in the universe because, you know, we just inherited a couple 100 pounds of alpaca wool. You know, that'll save me a fortune. I usually buy it by the ounce, and it's between $4 and $10 per ounce, depending on the length of the hair. This looked like it was white. It looked like it was pretty clean, but we figured that the sample was probably something that he had sent off and had cleaned and processed. So then my dad goes to pick up this wool, and he realizes that the trailer that he uses to move his mowers was much too small. He ended up having to have this massive trailer, like bigger than his truck, that he had to borrow from the guy that had the wool. They had to use forklifts. They had to get a forklift to load the bales. And my dad's truck could barely pull it. This guy had not been paid since October. And so my parents owed him like a couple $100 right off the bat for this wool that he had been keeping. So when I asked my mom, please keep that wool because I need some of it, she was like, okay, well, you're going to have to come deal with it. So I rearranged my schedule, and I drove about 400 miles up to see my family and see this wool. And when my mom said a couple 100 pounds of alpaca wool, it was a very gross underestimation of the amount of wool. There were 5 bales. One of them had broken open and was in horrible condition, so my dad just threw that into a ditch. So that left 4 bales that weighed 900 pounds each of Surrey alpaca wool that had been industrially washed and cleaned already. For those of you who are bad at math, that is literally 2 tons of alpaca wool. My dad's tractor was not strong enough to pull the things off the trailer. he ended up chaining his truck to these bales of wool and trying to pull them off the trailer, and the truck could barely do it. And I guess one of the bales landed on the sidewalk and broke their sidewalk, so that has to be repaired. And he dragged them through the yard and put the nicest bale where it wouldn't get wet. There was rain coming. I had to get up there before the bad weather. So because I hadn't seen the wool myself, I was thinking, you know, I would be lucky to get a box full, maybe 2 boxes full, that I could use for doll projects. And then when I got up there, I could tell that it had not been in storage particularly long. We don't know how long he had been trading wool, but he apparently had a pretty steady turnover of it. So I'm standing there next to this bale of wool that is the size of my car. I drive a Mustang, so you know it's not a huge car, but it's a pretty decent size because it's got to have room for that sports engine. And I'm looking at it, I'm thinking, my dad wants to put this in a ditch, and there are so many people out there who use this for making doll wigs and all kinds of craft projects, and it just seemed like such an enormous waste. So I turned around and I looked at my sisters and I said, hey, I bet we could sell some of this. If we sell it really cheap, then it'll end up in the hands of people who can use it for projects, people who would like to experiment, but they don't really have a lot of money to throw at alpaca wool with the normal prices. So I posted on Instagram saying that I was selling a lifetime supply of Surrey alpaca, and I offered it for $25 for 2 pounds of wool with free shipping included within the United States. And that ended up being a really bad idea. I had to stop accepting orders by 2 o'clock. I had posted it at maybe like 10 a.m. So, you know, it's about 4 hours later because I was already drowning in requests. And I received more than 150 messages from people who were interested, but I think we only got about 30 orders or so in the end. Even though the wool had been industrially washed, I wanted to make sure that we went through and picked out any dirt or burrs, because, you know, these were uncovered bales that my dad had hauled. It was on the trailer for about an hour, going up the interstate, through the country, so it was full of leaves and all kinds of stuff that it had caught in the wind, and we didn't want to send anybody anything like that. It had also been really wet, so in dragging the bales off the trailer, they got wet on the bottom, and that stuff on the bottom was just gross, and we didn't want to send anybody anything that I didn't think was usable myself. So me and my 2 youngest sisters started packing wool into boxes and sorting it, and it took way longer than I thought. Even having worked with Surrey alpaca before, I had no idea how much 2 pounds of wool was. I had taken my postal scale so that we could weigh the boxes and then fill them up, make sure that we got the right amount on there instead of trying to guesstimate. And it took us hours and hours. And I only had the time to be up there for a week. So by the end of the first day, when I had been to 6 or 7 post offices and nobody had boxes, I was standing there looking at this box with this tiny amount of wool that we had cleaned and sorted across the span of 2 hours, and I was thinking, I have gotten myself into a lot of trouble. So I stopped taking orders, and my sisters agreed that they would help me fill the boxes, sort the wool. So we would fill a big box out in the yard, go over to where my dad had this wool stored. They've got like this big extra garage or whatever, but we would fill up the boxes and put them in the garage in the house. And then we would take them into the house and sit down in the middle of my mom's beautiful sitting room off of her kitchen, and there was wool everywhere. And fortunately, my mom thought it was funny. My dad didn't think it was very funny. He'll think it's funny in a couple years. For a week, that was all I did. I packed wool in boxes, and I took them to the post office, and we shipped as many boxes as we could. there were people who were really disappointed, very unhappy with me because I couldn't give them any wool, but there was only so much that I could do. My brother ended up taking over a lot of orders at the end because, you know, I was leaving. I couldn't keep packing boxes. So I was sending people his way, and I said, you know, he can help you out. He's going to be on spring break. He'd be happy to take the stuff that I've already put in the garage, and he'll box it up and he'll send it to you. Because, you know, that was stuff I had already pulled off the bales with my sisters. We knew it was clean. We knew it was decent. With as many orders as we had within the first day, I think people probably expect that I made a lot of money off of it, but I had to drive 400 miles there and back, and then, you know, shipping was included in the price. We had to pay the guy that had been storing this wool, and then because it had taken up an entire week of my sister's lives and my brother's life after I left, I felt really bad about making them pick up my slack because I was stupid and I way underpriced the wool trying to be nice and get it to people that wanted it. So after we paid for the printer ink for all of the postage we printed, and after we paid my travel expenses to get up there to see the wool in the first place, I split the money between me and my sisters and my brother. And at the end of the day, an entire week of sorting wool and managing all of these orders and replying to messages from over 150 people, I walked away with $85. But the good news is that puts me about halfway to the replacement airbrush I need to get back to customizing dolls. So at the end of the day, it was a really funny experience and it's a funny story. And I did finish with 9 boxes of wool in my living room that I still need to sort and send to people. So maybe if I'm really lucky, by the time I'm done selling off all of the wool, I might be able to afford an airbrush. And there, wasn't that a lot more interesting than me talking about the coloring process? There's Firal with her herbs and her trinkets, and now she's ready to print for my character journal. And that's all for today. Thanks for watching, guys. See you later.